Here's a sentence that sounds like it genuinely shouldn't be true, and yet, according to multiple independent sources, it is. The tankers that keep getting hit in the Strait of Hormuz this specific week are, for the most part, not the ones you'd naturally expect going in. They're not the sanctioned, transponder off, ownership obscured vessels smuggling Iranian oil around the world through obscured registries and murky, hard-to-trace chartering arrangements. They're Greek-owned, properly flagged, fully insured, and fully compliant ships, operating well within every normal legal and commercial norm, and Iran, not the United States, is the party actually striking them. Meanwhile, the actual shadow fleet, the ships this entire story is nominally supposed to be about, has quietly been doing something almost nobody in mainstream coverage is tracking closely right now. And once you understand it, it turns out to be a genuinely stranger and more consequential story than any single missile strike making headlines this week. Let's start by defining the term properly and precisely, because shadow fleet gets thrown around loosely and carelessly in a lot of current coverage, and it genuinely deserves a precise, careful definition before we go any further into the details. According to Lloyd's List Intelligence, which has been tracking this specific category of vessel throughout the entire war, the shadow fleet refers to tankers, and increasingly gas carriers, that operate outside standard, transparent commercial shipping norms, typically through obscured ownership structures, flags of convenience, disabled or spoofed transponders, and a willingness to carry sanctioned cargo, oil from Iran, Russia, or Venezuela, that mainstream shipping companies won't touch because of the sanctions risk. These aren't rogue pirate vessels. They're a genuine, organized, multi-billion-dollar shadow industry that's existed for years, specifically to move sanctioned oil around the formal monitored global shipping system. Here's the number that should genuinely surprise you, more than almost anything else covered in this entire story so far. According to Lloyd's List's own analysis, about half of all tanker and gas carrier traffic over 10,000 deadweight tons transiting the Strait of Hormuz in the opening days of this war was part of the shadow fleet. Not a small, fringe minority tucked at the edges of the market, roughly half, an enormous, dominant share of total traffic. That's the scale we're actually talking about, an entire parallel shipping economy operating essentially in plain sight through one of the most heavily monitored waterways on the planet, right alongside the formal mainstream shipping industry. Now here's where the story gets genuinely counterintuitive, and it's worth sitting with because it inverts what you'd probably assume going in. Lloyd's List's reporting states that most mainstream ship owners have continued to view transits through the Strait of Hormuz as too risky throughout this war, with one notable exception, a Greek operator called Dynacom tankers. Meanwhile, shadow fleet vessels have kept passing through at a considerably higher rate. Why would the ships explicitly designed to evade sanctions and international scrutiny be more willing to sail into an active war zone than legitimate mainstream shipping companies? Lloyd's List's own analysis offers a specific answer. The gamble by shadow fleet vessels to keep transiting may stem from an assessment that they're less likely to be deliberately targeted by Iran, precisely because they're the ships actually serving Iran's own energy export economy. In other words, the shadow fleet calculated that Iran has a direct financial incentive not to sink the very ships carrying its own sanctioned oil to buyers abroad, while mainstream shipping companies, with no such protective relationship to either combatant, correctly assessed themselves as more exposed to indiscriminate risk. That calculation, according to that same reporting, hasn't been perfect. At least 2 shadow fleet tankers have been struck since the war began, despite the theoretical protection, which tells you Iran's targeting, even against its own economic lifeline, hasn't been flawless or fully controlled throughout this conflict. Let's talk about what's actually been happening to compliant, mainstream shipping instead, because this past week specifically has been brutal for exactly the ships that avoided the shadow fleet's riskier calculus. According to reporting from the Jerusalem Post, Dynacom tankers confirmed 2 of its managed vessels were hit by projectiles of unknown origin on Monday while sailing off the coast of Oman. The Malta-flagged tanker Kavamaleas was struck by 2 separate projectiles, causing a fire in its engine room severe enough that the master ordered a full evacuation after deploying the ship's fire suppression system. All crew members were safely recovered by Omani authorities. A second Dynacom vessel, the Liberian-flagged Akaluz, was also struck by a projectile that same day. According to Global Security, Org's operational tracking, multiple Dynacom vessels were reportedly struck within a single 24-hour period, between July 19th and 20th, with trade press describing visible tanker traffic in the strait as near a standstill in the aftermath. I want to be precise about attribution here, because it matters. Tradewinds' reporting notes Iran claims to have targeted ships passing through the strait, and the pattern, timing, and location are consistent with that claim. But reporting from Arab News specifically describes the projectiles as being of unknown origin as of official confirmation. So while the circumstantial case points toward Iran, and Iran itself has made retaliatory claims consistent with this pattern, I want to flag that the precise, confirmed attribution for these specific Dynacom strikes carries a bit more uncertainty than some of the other, more directly claimed and confirmed strikes we've covered elsewhere in this war. Here's the detail that actually connects this story to Shadow Fleet economics in a genuinely interesting way. According to Lloyd's List Intelligence's most recent brief, there's evidence of non-sanctioned Shadow Fleet tonnage, crude tankers, product tankers, and LPG carriers actively flipping into compliant trades right now. The Shadow Fleet has had its usual employment options significantly restricted, Venezuelan oil has been largely taken off the table as a source of business, and the U.S. naval blockade has reduced its access to the Iranian market specifically, its traditional bread and butter. Gulf states, broadly unable to access mainstream commercial shipping right now because legitimate operators are staying away from the region entirely, are becoming more willing to charter ships with a documented history of moving sanctioned oil, simply because those are increasingly the only vessels still willing to operate in the area at all. That's a genuinely fascinating market inversion, the Shadow Fleet, normally confined to the margins of legitimate commerce, specifically because of its sanctions history, is being pulled toward the mainstream, simply because the mainstream fleet has fled the region and left a vacuum behind. Let's talk about what the American military has actually confirmedly done regarding tanker traffic in this specific war, because this is where the title's framing needs real scrutiny. The most significant, directly confirmed American action against a specific tanker came on July 15th, when CENTCOM disabled a Curaçao-flagged tanker called the Belma, using Hellfire missiles, fired from an aircraft directly into the vessel's smokestack. CENTCOM's own statement said the ship had ignored multiple warnings while attempting to transit toward Karg Island in defiance of the reimposed American naval blockade, and that the strike specifically targeted the smokestack, a deliberate choice that disables propulsion while minimizing risk to the crew aboard. CENTCOM's statement ended bluntly: the ship is no longer transiting to Iran. That Belma tanker was struck again near Karg Island on July 17th, according to subsequent tracking. Separately, a different vessel, the Wen Yao, underwent a compliance boarding on July 16th, conducted by Marines from the 11th Marine Expeditionary Unit, physically inspecting cargo rather than disabling the vessel outright. So here's the honest, precise distinction worth drawing between these two separate stories, because conflating them is exactly what produces a misleading headline. American fighter jets and Navy aircraft have taken direct, confirmed kinetic action against specific tankers attempting to break the blockade and reach Iranian ports. That's real, that's documented. And the Belma incident specifically fits that description closely. But that's blockade enforcement against vessels defying an American-imposed naval quarantine, a fundamentally different category of action from striking Iran's broader Shadow Fleet as an economic or military target set generally. The Dynacom strikes making headlines this week, by contrast, are the reverse direction entirely. Iran hitting compliant, mainstream shipping, not America hitting Iran's sanctioned shadow tankers. Let's build out the broader economic backdrop. This is all playing out inside, because the numbers here are genuinely dramatic and worth understanding on their own terms. According to Global Security's tracking, only 30 verified transits through the strait were recorded between July 17th and 19th, with route selection remaining fragmented and ships increasingly sailing with transponders switched off entirely, making even basic traffic counting difficult for maritime intelligence firms to do with confidence. The Joint Maritime Information Center's severe risk grading, set on July 15th, has remained in effect throughout. Brent crude's gain for the month of July alone stands at approximately 20%, driven by what that same tracking describes as a combination of the strait's competing permission regimes, CENTCOM's blockade on one side and the IRGC's declaration that nothing moves through Hormuz without its coordination and permission on the other, alongside the specific Dynacom tanker strikes and a separate Houthi blockade declaration affecting the Bab el-Mandeb Strait further south. That last detail deserves its own mention because it shows this isn't purely a Strait of Hormuz story anymore. Data reported by The National, drawing on capillary tracking, showed Saudi crude loadings transiting the Bab el-Mandeb Strait down 36% over a 2-week window as the Houthi blockade declaration took hold, meaning 2 of the world's most critical oil choke points are now under simultaneous, separate pressure from 2 different armed actors in the same broader regional conflict. Let's dig into the Treasury and sanctions enforcement side of this story too, because it's the piece most directly connected to how America actually engages with the Shadow Fleet specifically, as opposed to the more dramatic kinetic strikes that generate bigger headlines. Reporting from the National Pulse notes that Iranian oil exports have faced renewed pressure as U.S. sanctions tighten specifically following this latest round of regional tensions and Iranian attacks on shipping. That sanctions enforcement dimension, revoking licenses, tightening Treasury restrictions, coordinating with allied nations to deflag or investigate suspected Shadow Fleet vessels, represents the slower, less visually dramatic, but arguably more consistently applied American tool for pressuring the Shadow Fleet specifically, running in parallel with the more occasional headline-grabbing kinetic actions like the Belma strike. According to United Against Nuclear Iran's ongoing tanker tracking, this sanctions and enforcement pressure campaign extends well beyond just this specific war too, with reporting on efforts urging Panama to investigate and to flag ghost fleet vessels registered there, congressional pressure on Treasury to more aggressively enforce existing oil sanctions, and even instances of legitimate shipping companies unknowingly getting caught up in shadow fleet adjacent smuggling schemes, illustrating just how deliberately obscured and difficult to cleanly police this entire shadow economy actually is, even for governments and international bodies actively trying to crack down on it. Let's go deeper on how the shadow fleet actually operates mechanically, because understanding the specific tactics involved explains why it's proven so difficult for any single military action, American or otherwise, to meaningfully disrupt. These vessels typically rely on a combination of techniques specifically designed to obscure who owns them, what they're carrying, and where they're actually going at any given moment. Ship-to-ship transfers, where cargo is moved from one tanker to another in international waters, well outside any single country's territorial monitoring, allow sanctioned Iranian crude to effectively launder its origin before reaching a buyer, making the oil that eventually arrives at a refinery difficult to trace back to its actual source. Flag hopping, repeatedly reflagging a vessel under different, often smaller or less rigorously regulated national registries, complicates enforcement because different flag states have wildly different levels of willingness and capacity to investigate or deregister a vessel suspected of sanctions violations. And transponder manipulation, either disabling automatic identification system broadcasts entirely or spoofing them to show a false location, makes real-time tracking by satellite and maritime intelligence firms considerably harder, even though modern satellite imagery analysis has gotten increasingly sophisticated at spotting these gaps and inconsistencies over time. This isn't a new phenomenon invented for this specific war either. It's worth understanding that the shadow fleet, as an organized, large-scale industry, predates this conflict by years, having grown substantially in size and sophistication, specifically in response to sanctions regimes targeting Russia's oil exports following its invasion of Ukraine, with Iran and Venezuela's sanctioned oil sectors adopting and adapting many of the same techniques, and in some documented cases, even some of the same specific vessels and operators. That existing infrastructure, already built, tested, and operational before this particular war even began, is part of why Iran's shadow fleet was able to continue functioning relatively smoothly through the opening weeks of this conflict, rather than needing to build sanctions evasion capacity from scratch under wartime pressure. There's a specific, fascinating data point from Lloyd's List's earlier reporting worth including here, because it illustrates just how unusual this entire situation has become, even by the shadow fleet's own historical standards. That reporting noted a vessel loaded oil at Iran's Jask terminal, located south of the Strait, for only the 5th time in 5 years. Read that carefully. A full 5-year stretch producing just 5 total loadings at that specific terminal, and this war's disruption to normal shipping patterns has apparently made that historically rare route active again, presumably because it offers some routing advantage or reduced exposure compared to loading at facilities deeper inside the more heavily monitored and more frequently targeted areas further up the Gulf. That's exactly the kind of granular, almost forensic detail maritime intelligence firms like Lloyd's List specialize in tracking. And it tells you the shadow fleet isn't just continuing to operate through this war unchanged, it's actively adapting its specific routes and terminals in response to where the fighting and the blockade enforcement are actually concentrated at any given moment. Let's also cover the 6 ballast tankers that made U-turns after the war's opening days, because that earlier data point from Lloyd's List adds useful texture to how even shadow fleet operators, despite their generally higher risk tolerance, responded to the most acute initial phase of this conflict. According to that earlier reporting, at least 6 ballast shadow fleet tankers, meaning empty vessels heading toward Iran specifically to load cargo, reversed course after the war's February 28th start, with 4 of them specifically diverting while sailing westbound toward the Strait, presumably en route to load Iranian oil, before turning back and drifting instead in the Gulf of Oman or the Arabian Sea. That tells you even the shadow fleet's generally higher risk tolerance has real limits, and that the most acute, uncertain opening days of active combat were enough to trigger genuine caution even among operators whose entire business model is built around tolerating risk levels that scare away mainstream shipping entirely. If untangling exactly how this shadow economy actually functions mechanically, rather than treating it as a vague, abstract category, is useful to you, go ahead and hit that like button now, because walking through the actual tactics, ship-to-ship transfers, flag hopping, transponder manipulation, takes real research to lay out clearly, and it only keeps happening with engagement behind it. Let's spend some time on the broader historical pattern of tanker attacks specifically, because this current war isn't the first time the Gulf's shipping lanes have become an active battlefield, and that history adds useful context for understanding current events. There's a well-documented history of what's sometimes called the shadow war between Israel and Iran, playing out specifically through tanker attacks over recent years, well before this current, much larger conflict began. U.S. Navy investigators concluded in one earlier, separate incident that an Iranian drone, specifically a Shahed 136, the same model Iran has supplied to Russia for use in its war against Ukraine, was used to strike an oil tanker linked to an Israeli billionaire off the coast of Oman. That incident, involving the tanker Pacific Zircon, followed an earlier similar strike on a different Israeli-associated vessel called the Mercer Street. Vice Admiral Brad Cooper, at the time commanding U.S. Naval Forces Central Command, described that earlier attack as deliberate, flagrant, and dangerous, language that's since become a familiar refrain throughout this much larger current conflict as well. There's also a documented history of Iran attempting to physically seize tankers outright, rather than simply striking them with missiles or drones. In one earlier separate incident, Iranian naval forces attempted to capture 2 oil tankers in the Gulf of Oman in a single overnight operation, with one Iranian vessel sailing toward a Marshall Islands flag tanker before being deterred by the American guided missile destroyer USS McFall and a separate Iranian vessel inching within a single mile of a different tanker, the Richmond Voyager, hailing it to stop and firing on the commercial ship before that same American destroyer arrived again to deter the encounter. That pattern, attempted seizure rather than pure destruction, represents a genuinely different category of tanker threat than the missile and drone strikes dominating coverage of this current phase of the war. And it's worth remembering that both categories, seizure attempts and direct strikes, have been part of Iran's broader toolkit against shipping in this region for years, not something invented specifically for this current conflict. Let's return to the current war specifically and cover one more important piece of context: the Skylight incident from the opening days of this conflict, because it illustrates something important about Iran's actual targeting behavior that connects directly back to our shadow fleet discussion. According to maritime intelligence firm Windward AI, cited in Fox News coverage, a sanctioned Palau flag tanker called Skylight, which itself held Iranian nationals among its crew and had documented ties to the Iranian regime, was struck as the conflict entered its second day. Windward's own analysis concluded that the pattern of vessel targeting in that opening window pointed toward what they called indiscriminate area denial rather than precision targeting, specifically aimed at demonstrating Iran's capability to disrupt the strait and deter commercial shipping broadly, rather than carefully distinguishing between shadow fleet vessels serving Iran's own interests and mainstream shipping working against them. That's a genuinely important nuance because it suggests Iran's actual targeting behavior, at least in that earlier phase, wasn't as cleanly protective of its own shadow fleet as the more recent theoretical framework Lloyd's List described would suggest. Iran apparently struck even a vessel with documented regime ties during that specific window, indicating real limits to how precisely or consistently any single actor in this conflict has actually been able to distinguish friendly from unfriendly shipping under the practical chaos of active combat conditions. Let's also touch on the broader Cuba angle mentioned in some of this same reporting, because it's a useful reminder that shadow fleet dynamics and blockade enforcement as tools of pressure aren't unique to the Iran conflict specifically. Fox News' reporting noted the U.S. has already established a quasi-naval quarantine of oil imports to Cuba, with countries like Mexico separately warned against sending oil to what that reporting called malign regimes, while European partners have separately tightened restrictions, specifically targeting shadow fleet vessels tied to Russia. That broader pattern tells you the shadow fleet, as a phenomenon and as a target for enforcement action, extends well beyond just this one specific war. It's become a genuinely global feature of how sanctioned states now move oil, and how the countries imposing those sanctions have increasingly responded with blockade-style enforcement as a shared tactic across multiple separate geopolitical conflicts simultaneously. And I want to be clear, this section moves into interpretation rather than additional sourced reporting. I think the most important correction to make here is that this week's dramatic tanker headlines and the Shadow Fleet's actual current behavior are, counterintuitively, almost separate stories running in parallel. The ships getting visibly struck and generating the most coverage, the Dynacom vessels, are compliant, mainstream shipping being targeted by Iran, not Shadow Fleet vessels being targeted by the U.S. The Shadow Fleet itself, meanwhile, has been quietly adapting and expanding its market position, specifically because the mainstream fleet's retreat from the region has created new opportunities for exactly the kind of higher risk sanctions-adjacent operators the Shadow Fleet specializes in. Second, I think the Belma incident remains the single clearest example of direct American kinetic action, specifically against the kind of blockade-running behavior associated with Shadow Fleet operations, and it's worth watching whether that specific tactic, disabling a vessel's propulsion via a precision strike to its smokestack rather than sinking it outright, becomes a repeated pattern going forward as the blockade continues, or whether it remains a rare, isolated example rather than a routine enforcement tool. Third, The market inversion Lloyd's list identified shadow fleet tonnage flipping into compliant trades specifically because Gulf states have run out of mainstream alternatives deserves real attention going forward, because if that trend continues, it would represent a genuinely significant longer-term restructuring of who actually moves oil through this region, with lasting consequences well beyond whenever this specific war eventually ends. A war that accelerates the normalization of sanctions, evading shipping infrastructure into mainstream commercial use, is a war with economic aftershocks considerably longer lasting than any single missile strike, however dramatic that strike might look in the moment. Fourth, and this connects directly back to correcting the framing in this video's title, watch closely whether the U.S. shifts its kinetic tanker enforcement tactics specifically toward the shadow fleet in the coming weeks, rather than staying focused primarily on blockade-running vessels, attempting to reach Iranian ports specifically. Those are related but distinct target categories. A blockade-running tanker is defying a specific American-imposed rule about not transiting toward Iranian ports at all, while a shadow fleet vessel more broadly is defined by its ownership structure and sanctions evasion history, and could theoretically be operating in full compliance with the current blockade's specific terms while still fitting the broader shadow fleet definition. If American enforcement genuinely broadens from the narrower blockade-running category toward the shadow fleet as a whole, that would represent a real, meaningful escalation in scope, worth tracking closely as a distinct development from what's been confirmed so far. Let's cover one more dimension of this story that connects everything together, the insurance and risk market side, because it's the mechanism that actually determines which specific ships are willing to sail into this specific waterway at any given moment, more than any single military action does on its own. War risk insurance premiums for vessels transiting the Strait of Hormuz have climbed sharply throughout this conflict, and that cost increase falls very differently across different categories of shipping. Mainstream, legitimate operators typically carry comprehensive, fully compliant insurance coverage through established Western maritime insurers, coverage that becomes extraordinarily expensive and, in some cases, effectively unavailable at any price for a designated war zone transit. Shadow fleet operators, by contrast, frequently operate with minimal, non-standard, or entirely absent insurance coverage to begin with, which is itself part of how they keep operating costs low enough to make sanctioned oil trading profitable in the first place. That structural difference means a war zone premium spike that might make a transit financially non-viable for a fully insured mainstream tanker barely registers as an additional cost for a shadow fleet vessel that was already operating largely outside the formal insurance market to begin with. That's a huge part of the actual economic mechanism, explaining why shadow fleet vessels have continued transiting at higher rates throughout this war. It's not just risk tolerance in some abstract sense. It's a fundamentally different cost structure that makes the same physical risk translate into wildly different financial calculations, depending on which category of ship you're actually looking at. Let's also spend a moment on why this specific dynamic matters so much for how the rest of this war likely plays out economically, beyond just this current moment. If mainstream shipping continues avoiding the region, while shadow fleet tonnage increasingly absorbs the resulting demand, as Lloyd's List's tracking already shows beginning to happen, that represents a structural shift in who actually controls oil logistics through one of the world's most important choke points, not just a temporary wartime disruption that reverses cleanly once fighting eventually stops. Shipping relationships, chartering arrangements, and insurance markets that develop and solidify during a prolonged crisis like this one tend to persist afterward. Because switching back to more expensive, fully compliant mainstream shipping, once a cheaper, already established alternative, has proven it can reliably move cargo through the same routes requires overcoming real inertia, not just an improvement in the underlying security situation. That's part of why the market inversion happening right now, however it initially started, purely as an emergency wartime adaptation, carries the potential to outlast the war itself as a lasting change in how oil actually moves through this specific region. There's a broader geopolitical angle worth touching on here too, because the countries actually buying this oil have their own stake in how this shadow fleet story develops. Nations that have historically relied on shadow fleet imports specifically to access sanctioned oil at a discount, largely concentrated in parts of Asia, according to reporting from United Against Nuclear Iran's ongoing tracking work, now face a genuinely complicated calculation of their own. A shadow fleet that's increasingly absorbed into servicing legitimate Gulf state exports, rather than remaining purely dedicated to moving explicitly sanctioned Iranian, Russian, or Venezuelan cargo, could mean reduced capacity specifically available for those traditional sanctioned trade routes, potentially tightening supply and raising costs for buyers who've built entire import strategies around accessing discounted, sanctions-evading oil. That's a genuinely underexplored economic ripple effect of this entire war. The shadow fleet's wartime pivot toward compliant Gulf state cargo could end up squeezing exactly the sanctioned trade routes it originally existed to serve, an unintended consequence of a purely opportunistic wartime business adaptation, rather than any deliberate policy outcome anyone actually planned or intended. Let's bring this back to the specific military and strategic stakes one more time before we wrap up the full picture. Because it's worth remembering why any of this economic detail actually matters beyond pure market analysis. Every one of these dynamics, the insurance cost asymmetry, the Shadow Fleet's opportunistic pivot toward compliant cargo, the historical pattern of both strikes and attempted seizures, exists specifically because the Strait of Hormuz remains one of the most strategically vital pieces of geography on the planet, carrying a share of global oil and gas exports large enough that disruptions here ripple into fuel prices and inflation calculations for countries with no direct connection to this conflict whatsoever. Understanding the Shadow Fleet's actual behavior, rather than the simplified, misleadingly attributed version implied by a headline like the one that brought you to this video, matters because it's genuinely one of the clearer available indicators of how seriously the people actually moving physical cargo through this waterway are pricing the real ongoing risk, arguably a more reliable signal than any single government's public statements from either side of this conflict. So here's the accurate, current state of this story, summarized cleanly one final time. The tankers making the most dramatic headlines this week, Dynacom's Kavamaleas and Akaluz, are compliant, mainstream Greek-operated vessels struck by projectiles consistent with Iranian attribution, not Shadow Fleet vessels targeted by the U.S. Iran's actual Shadow Fleet, roughly half of all Hormuz tanker traffic by Lloyd's List's own analysis, has continued transiting at a higher rate than mainstream shipping throughout this war, based on a calculation that Iran has an economic incentive not to target the ships carrying its own sanctioned oil, a calculation that's held imperfectly, with at least 2 Shadow Fleet tankers struck despite it. The clearest confirmed example of direct American kinetic action against blockade-running tanker traffic remains the Belma incident, disabled by Hellfire missiles fired into its smokestack on July 15th for defying the reimposed naval blockade toward Karg Island. And the Shadow Fleet itself is currently adapting and expanding into compliant trades, specifically because mainstream shipping's retreat from the region has created new market opportunities, a quieter, less dramatic, but genuinely significant economic story running underneath all of this week's more visible strikes. If getting the accurate, properly attributed version of a story like this, rather than a headline that quietly swaps which side did what to which fleet, matters to you, go ahead and tap that like button right now. Because untangling Shadow Fleet economics from blockade enforcement from Iranian retaliatory strikes takes real, careful research. And it only keeps happening with engagement behind it. If you want the next breakdown to go deeper specifically on that market inversion, Shadow Fleet tonnage flipping into compliant trades, and what it could mean for the region's shipping economy well after this war eventually ends, drop that request in the comments below because that's a substantial economic thread that deserves its own fully dedicated treatment. And subscribe if you want to track whether American enforcement actually broadens from blockade-running vessels specifically toward the Shadow Fleet as a whole in the coming weeks, because that specific shift, if it happens, would represent a genuinely significant escalation distinct from anything confirmed so far. And I intend to bring you the fully sourced version of it the moment it does, rather than whatever exaggerated or misattributed version of it starts circulating first across the wider internet.